Good old Eeyore, that lovable loser who always has something going wrong in his life. He can never have something good happen to him, and even when something sort of good happens, I mean, he lost his tail, but at least he had a friend that was cared enough about him to give him a new tail. But Eeyore can't even see the good in that situation. He says that it's not a nice tail for not much of a donkey. Eeyore is the epitome of the depressed person that's just down in the pit, something that we're going to talk about today. They can never see the bright side. They're always pointed towards the dark side. They're always seeing the negative. They're always seeing their moments of failure in life. They're always seeing their mistakes. They're always seeing the things that happen to them that are out of their control that are bad. They never see the good in any situation. And I think that while Eeyore is a very severe case, we've probably all encountered an Eeyore maybe in our life, in our travels. You know, the person who always seems down in the dumps, the person who maybe walks with their shoulders slumped and their head hung low all the time, the person who just seems to be carrying this weight, this very heavy burden, and that no matter the amount of good that may come their way, they will always be predisposed, whether he or she, to always just be focused on the negative, to dwell on the negative. To them, the good will never outweigh the bad. That's how it is for the Eeyores of the world. And I think at least we can think of a person who fits at least some of these criteria, or a person who's maybe gone through a season of that life, or maybe you think you've gone through that season. And while, again, this is an extreme example of someone that's just down in that pit, I think we all have a little bit of Eeyore in us. We all have a little bit of Eeyore tendencies because, number one, I think it's pretty clear we all have bad things happen to us in life. Life never goes according to our plan. It never goes perfectly. And those negatives, a lot of times, those times where we've maybe failed or times where we've messed up, times where life got difficult and we encountered trouble, maybe struggles at work or where we had a coworker we couldn't get along with, or maybe you lost work, or struggles in your personal life with a broken or a wounded relationship, or struggles with finances because of a loss of work, or just times where things weren't adding up and you didn't know how you were going to make ends meet, or maybe you had struggles with health. Maybe you got a bad diagnosis, or you were just in pain and you couldn't understand why, or maybe it led to the worst thing that can really happen to us, a death of a loved one. Or times where you made a mistake, something that was in your control, times where you spoke a word that you just wish you could go back and take back, or you did something that you wish you could go back in time and redo it, and you wouldn't redo it. The negatives always overshadow the positives in those moments. No matter how much good comes our way in life, I think we're a people that is just surrounded by negativity, and we can be almost drowned by that. And an example for that, of an example of just not being able to see the good in the situation and the bad, always overcoming the good, is from my own life, and it comes with my job. Now, if I take a step back and I look at my job as a whole, there were a lot of positives that came from that time there. For example, I got to work with cars, which is something that I love. Work was very consistent. It wasn't really seasonal. There wasn't a lot of highs and lows with my income, even though it was a fully commissioned job. Income was solid. I got to work with and meet a lot of great customers. There's always some that gets on your nerves, but most of them were good. I got to work with a lot of great people that I got along with great and had a lot of common interests with. Well, except for, and there's always that one person, at least for me, except for one guy that I couldn't get along with. And have we? And it doesn't. It seems like to me, no matter the circle you're in, whether it's at work or a social setting or maybe even in the church, there seems, if you get along with everybody, isn't there always that one guy or gal that's just kind of the thorn in your side, that no matter how hard you try, you just can't get along with it? And that's how it was for me at Rocky Ridge, at Rocky Ridge. And unfortunately for me, that one guy was my boss, so there was a lot of difficulties that came from that. And but I named to you several positive things and one bad thing at my time there at Rocky Ridge. But when I just quick thought think of Rocky Ridge, do you think I think of all the good, or do I think of the one negative thing?
One negative.
Yeah, the first thought is the one negative thing. And I tell you this story to show us how we are as individuals, no matter the amount of good things that come to us or happen around us, we're naturally going to first look towards the negative instead of the good. And that can become a cloud of bad things that we're naturally going to carry with us, or a baggage that we're going to carry with us. And it's those negative moments that kind of stoke how severe our case of the Eeyores are, and how if we can focus on the good instead of the bad. But the question I want to try to answer today, and kind of the remedy for what I've called the case of the Eeyores, is I want to show us how we can move past those bad mistakes. Those moments that no matter how deep in the pit we may think we are, no matter how much burden we're carrying, show us how we can move past them, those bad moments in life. And to do that, I want to look at the passage that Pastor Jonathan read, Luke 24, verses 1 through 12. And we're going to focus on one guy's perspective, because I think one guy in this moment is at the peak case of the Eeyores. He is being crushed almost by his mistakes and his bad moments and his circumstances, and it's weighing down on him in an intensity that we might not have even experienced in our lives yet, because it actually led to the death of his close friend, and that guy would be Peter. Now, to see the context of this whole passage, the text tells us that Mary Magdalene and the other women go to the tomb on Sunday morning, the third day after Jesus died, to finish the embalming process of Jesus Christ. But when they arrive, to their surprise, the large stone that they had rolled in front of the grave to keep Jesus in there had been rolled away. And it's not only that once the stone was rolled away, once they entered the tomb, the women see that Jesus' body is nowhere to be found. And while they're still standing there in the tomb, I'm sure in a state of shock, trying to process all of this, a guy in white clothes shows up, and he's bright and shining. And out of the fear, the women drop to the ground at the uncommon event and bow down. And these men ask the women, "Why do you look for the living amongst the dead?" They tell the women that not only is Jesus not here, not like somebody came and stole his body, which I would assume was what the women were probably thinking. It's not that someone took his body, it's that Jesus' body got up, it came to life again, and it came out of the grave under its own power. He had risen from the grave. He was dead, and now he was alive. And I'm sure this surprised and shocked the women even more than the empty tomb. But the men pretty much say, in more or less words, "Why are you surprised at this?" They remind the women that Jesus told you that this very thing was going to happen, that Jesus was going to be turned into the hands of evil men, and he was going to die and suffer a horrible death, and for 3 days he would be gone, but on the third day he would rise again. And at that, once the men remind the women of this, Luke, the author of Luke, tells us that they remembered his words. And at that, they returned to the place where Jesus' 11 remaining disciples were at. Luke then tells us that the women, I'm sure you can imagine, excitedly tell the disciples and those who were gathered there what the men in white told them, that Jesus' tomb was empty, that the stone was rolled away when they got there, and that Jesus' body was missing. And it wasn't that someone took it. The men in white, the angels, said that it was because Jesus was alive again. And I'm sure that they reminded the men, the disciples, of what Jesus told them, that this very thing would happen. But Luke tells us that it seemed like nonsense to them. Most of the disciples didn't have a reaction because they dismissed it as nonsense. There's no way that Jesus had really been brought back to life. However, that was the reaction of 10 of the 11 disciples, but Luke points out that one guy had a different reaction. One guy got up and not only went to the tomb, but it says that he ran to the tomb to see it for himself. And that guy, of course, was Peter. Now, we also know from John's account of the Easter morning story that John himself also goes with Peter to the tomb and runs to the tomb. But Luke only mentions Peter running to the tomb. And I think if you know the context of Peter's life and the Bible and the Gospels to this point, and if you know who Luke is, I think there's a beautiful reason for that, because Luke, his day job, if you will, he was a doctor. As Jonathan said, he was a physician, or as the Greek says, one who heals. So Luke was in the business. His life was devoted to giving remedies for what ailed people. When people were sick, Luke was the guy that tried to help them out. And I think Luke, by pointing out the fact that Peter, the guy that we're going to see that had to be under this immense weight of his past and of his mistakes, by pointing out that Peter, of all the guys, was the only one that had the faith to go and to even run and check out that maybe what the women said was true, that Jesus really did rise from the grave. I think Luke is giving us a remedy for how we can come out of that pit, how we can drop some of the baggage that we're carrying, that we may be carrying. Because I want to think about what had to be on Peter's mind, the burden that he was carrying as he runs to the tomb this Easter morning. Because the Bible tells us, it picks up Peter's life. He's a fisherman, which certainly wasn't the least dignified job, but it wasn't the most glorious job of his day. He wasn't a religious leader or a political leader. He didn't have any real standing in society, which you would think is what Jesus would be looking for his disciples, or what we would be looking for if it was Jesus. But Peter, out of nowhere, out of nothing that he did, gets this amazing opportunity to follow this amazing guy who's following around and drawing massive crowds to the point that he has to tell people to go away with his teaching, and he's performing miracles, and he's healing the sick and making the paralyzed walk and the blind see. And not only does does Peter get to follow Jesus around, he gets to be chosen as one of his 12 closest followers, of his 12 disciples, his 12 closer friends. He gets to be on the inner circle. And as time goes on, not only does Peter get to be chosen as one of the 12 closest men to Jesus, but Peter gets to be kind of on the inner circle, the inner circle of the Jesus' three closest confidants, his three closest disciples, which was made up of Peter, James, and John. And to this, we would say, this is an amazing opportunity for this fisherman to follow this amazing teacher and get to be on his inner circle. Peter got to experience things that we could only dream about in our life, and you would think that all this good, this amazing opportunity, that would create clear sailing from Peter from there on out. But unfortunately, from that moment, things not only don't go clear sailing for Peter, it seems that there's just moment after moment of his mistakes. Some are more severe than others, but Peter, the Bible points out a lot of Peter's bad moments, those moments that had to be weighing down on Peter. Let's go back to the story of Transfiguration to see one, where Jesus is on the mountain with that inner circle, Peter, James, and John, and Peter's there for this amazing moment where Jesus' clothes become white and the presence of God is there, and Moses and Elijah appear in a glorious splendor, and Peter, I'm sure his heart was in the right place and he was just excited, I would assume. But he opens his mouth and he says something that he really shouldn't have, or he should have just kept his mouth probably shut altogether. But he says that it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for Jesus and one for Moses and Elijah. Now, if you know anything about this story, this was not the good thing to say. This moment was all about Jesus, and Moses and Elijah were just there. So to say that put up shelters for them as well just really missed the point of the moment for Peter. Luke even writes, and I laugh at this in parentheses because it kind of sums up Peter. Luke says, Peter did not know what he was saying. He didn't know what he was talking about, yet he said something that he shouldn't. And Peter actually gets scolded by the thundering voice of God. Now, while we've probably never been scolded by the thundering voice of God for something that we've said, I bet there's a time in our life where we've said something that we just wish we could take back. Maybe in that exact moment we said it, we're like, oh man, I shouldn't have said that. I should have reworded it maybe. And I'm sure Peter, this mistake maybe was weighing down on him as he's running to the grave. Now flash forward to the Garden of Gethsemane. Peter is there with Jesus, and Jesus is in this amazingly agonizing moment. Jesus knows the pain. He knows the suffering that he's about to endure on the cross. And Jesus takes his 12 disciples to the garden, and then he takes that inner circle of 3, Peter, James, and John, even further into the garden, and Jesus is going to go off and pray, and he just asks Peter, James, and John to stay awake, keep watch for him, and pray as Jesus goes off by himself. And this is such an agonizing moment for Jesus. Luke tells us that Jesus was in so much agony that blood poured out of his pores. This is a horrible moment for Jesus, and he's hoping that his friends, his disciples, would be able to be there for him. But not only do they not keep watch, not only do they not pray for him, Jesus comes back to find Peter and the other two asleep. They couldn't even stay awake for him in this moment of Jesus' great moment of need. Now, do we carry the weight in our lives of a time where we left someone we cared about down? A loved one, a friend, a coworker. I bet that this mistake of letting his close friend down in his time of most need was on Peter's mind as he runs to the grave. Now from there, you don't have to go far at all to see Peter's next mistake that's found in just a few verses later in Luke 22, verses 47 through 53. The soldiers come to arrest Jesus. Judas betrays Jesus into the hands of the Romans. And Peter, again, maybe reacts probably out of his emotions, probably out of his anger and fear, and maybe even thought he was doing the right thing and trying to defend Jesus. But he pulls out his sword and he cuts off one of the soldiers' ears. Now, Jesus does not only not commend him for this, he actually scolds him. He says, "No more of this." And he heals the soldier's ear. Now, here's an example. We saw Peter speak without thinking. Now he just acted without thinking. He let his emotions, probably again his anger or his fear, cause him to do something that he now regrets. And I'm sure we've all been there as well. A moment where we acted out of our emotions, or just a moment where we did something we wish we could redo. And I'm sure this was weighing down Peter as he runs to the grave. Now let's move just a few verses later in Luke 22, verses 53 through 62. Peter's most famous mistakes, one of the most famous mistakes of the Bible, and of really in all the world, is and it had to be the primary thing on Peter's mind as he runs to the tomb, the thing that had Peter down in the pit. We see Jesus is on trial, and obviously we know Jesus did nothing to be on trial, much less to be crucified. And you would expect Peter, one of his inner circle friends, his closest disciples, to be there for him and go to the trial and say, Jesus doesn't deserve any of this. He doesn't deserve to be crucified or even be here on trial. But not only does Peter not stand up for his friend in his time of need, but Peter, on 3 separate occasions, out of his own fear, denies even knowing Jesus in this moment. He denies knowing the man that he had left everything in his life behind to follow. The guy that had given him this amazing opportunity to see miracles performed, people healed, amazing teaching, gain a status that he would have never gained on his own. He denies even knowing him in his time of need. And now we know what happens. Jesus is then unjustly sentenced to an absolutely horrifying and horrible death on the cross. And here Peter is on Easter morning, left with the weight of his mistakes, left with the weight of his past, and left ultimately with the death of Jesus. When Jesus died on the cross, when his life ended there, I'm sure Peter thought that his life was more or less over as well. Now that Jesus was dead, there seemed to be no way for Peter that he could ever remove the weight of the guilt that he had for denying his friend and all his other mistakes. And like I said, Peter had also left his life behind to follow Jesus. And now Jesus is dead. All of these things were weighing down on Peter, and his life was in shambles. He was at his lowest moment. Peter was at a moment in his life where it seemed impossible, I'm sure, to be able to look past the negatives. They were surrounding him. He had the ultimate case of the Eeyores. He was as deep in the pit as you could go. And we can all, I'm sure, think of a moment in our life where, just like Peter, we were surrounded by negatives, surrounded by the weight of our circumstances, seemingly with no way to move from underneath the weight of our situation. That's where Peter was before the women got there. But then the women come and they tell of Jesus' resurrection. He gets this lifeline thrown to him. And Peter might not have believed it just out of faith that Jesus had really risen from the grave. But the thing you got to respect about Peter is he was at least going to run to the grave and find out for himself. He was going to get there as fast as he can and see if this really had happened. And I think that's a great lesson for us today. We know that Jesus really did rise again. And we know that Peter was reinstated because of his resurrection, because of Jesus' resurrection. And all that weight, it's not like it didn't happen, but it didn't matter anymore because Jesus had overcome it all when he arose from the grave. And just like Peter, I believe Jesus is asking each of us this morning to run to the grave. He's asking us to come to his empty tomb, come to the empty bedside, and experience it. Experience the love that it had to take to do all this and suffer all this on the cross and the power of his resurrection. He's asking us to come not empty-handed, though. He's asking us to bring our burdens, bring our mistakes of our past, bring the times where we've messed up and lay them down at his feet, at the feet of his empty grave. The fact that the evil that forced Jesus to the cross, all the evil that we are all responsible for, Jesus suffered under it, and he ultimately died under it, but that wasn't the end. That evil that surrounded him was overcome by Jesus when he rose from the grave, and he can overcome what surrounds us as well. Jesus is inviting us to bring our wrongs, to bring what has a hold of us to the grave, just like Peter, and let him overcome it. Trusting that Jesus' grace, that his love, that his mercy, his power of his resurrection are all sufficient to meet you where you are. And it's not only that he just forgives your sins. 1 Corinthians tells us that if anyone is in Christ, he is a brand new creation. The old has gone. The new has come. Jesus says that when you come to him because of the grave, because of his resurrection, you become something new. Jesus says that you are new, that you are loved. When you come to him and those burdens you're carrying, it's not like it's a magic elixir where life just goes perfectly, but that past is overcome by your future, by what you are and what Jesus did on you on the cross and when he walked out of the grave. I invite you this morning to forget who you say you are, who your mistakes say you are, and see you as Jesus sees you, as a beloved child of his Father's. Someone that he was willing to go to the cross for and suffer an agonizing death, but he overcame that for you. And with that, if you're able, let's please stand for our next worship song, which is Who You Say I Am by Among the Thirsty. And this song, I think, really puts into words what I'm talking about, how we become new creations in Christ and the power that's in the resurrection of Jesus Christ and what it still means for us today. So if you're able, please stand.
My sin says I'm unworthy. My shame that I'm alone. My heart tells me I'm broken, and I can't be made whole. But ever since the day I ran into your grace, you call me righteous, you call me yours, no longer guilty, not anymore, and I am rewritten, I'm spoken for, a new creation now I stand, because of who you say I am. Lord, help me to believe it. Your salvation covers me.